Hey, what's up, APUSH kids? We're back for our next lecture here in AP US History. Our topic today is topic 6.4, the New South. Our learning objective that we're going to have is objective 6C, explain how various factors contributed to continuity and change in the New South from 1877 to 1898. We have two major key ideas. Our first one says that despite the industrialization of some segments of the Southern economy, a change promoted by Southern leaders who called for a quote-unquote New South, agricultural based on sharecropping and tenant farming continued to be the primary economic activity in the South. Now, that sharecropping and tenant farming was something that we discussed in our last unit, and this was the cycle of poverty, the sharecropper cycle of poverty that we talked about during the era of Reconstruction. This was the idea where you would essentially rent land from a landowner. You would give them up to half of your crop just for the rent of the land, and then you had additional charges for tools, seeds, etc. that you would accumulate throughout the year, and by the end of the year you would even up with the landowner, and oftentimes you would still be in debt by the end. However, we do try and see during this time period this idea of this New South that does start to develop during this time. Industrialization is going to start developing the post-war South, starting in Birmingham, Alabama, which developed into one of the nation's leading steel producers. Additionally, Memphis, Tennessee prospered as a center for the South's growing lumber industry, and Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy, became the capital of the nation's tobacco industry. Now, likewise, in Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina are going to overtake New England states as the chief producers of textiles. By 1900, the South had 400 cotton mills, employing almost 100,000 white workers. Now, this industrialization was spurred as Southern railroad companies rapidly converted to the standard gauge rails used in the North and West. So the South was integrated into the national rail network. The South's rate of post-war growth from 1865 to 1900 equaled or surpassed that of the rest of the country in population, industry, and railroads. Some Southern farmers sought to diversify their farming to escape the trap of depending entirely on cotton. George Washington Carver, an African-American scientist at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, promoted the growing of such crops as peanuts, sweet potatoes, and soybeans. His work played an important role in shifting Southern agriculture towards a more diversified base. However, despite progress and growth, the South remained a largely agricultural section, and also the poorest region in the country. To a greater extent than before the war, Northern financing dominated much of the Southern economy. Additionally, most Southerners of both races remained in traditional roles and barely got by from year to year as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Leading us to key idea number 2. The Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson that upheld racial segregation helped to mark the end of most of the political gains African Americans made during Reconstruction. Facing increased violence, discrimination, and scientific theories of race, African American reformers continued to fight for political and social equality. With the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the North withdrew its protection of freedmen and left Southerners to work out solutions to their own social and economic problems. The Democratic politicians who came to power in the Southern states after Reconstruction, known as Redeemers, won support from two groups, the business community and the white supremacist. The latter group favored policies of separating or segregating public facilities for blacks and whites as a means of treating African Americans as social inferiors. During Reconstruction, federal laws had protected Southern blacks from discriminatory acts by local and state governments. Starting in the late 1870s, however, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down one Reconstruction Act after another, applying to civil rights. The civil rights cases of 1883, the court ruled that Congress could not legislate against the racial discrimination practiced by private citizens, which included railroads, hotels, and other businesses used by the public. These federal court decisions supported a wave of segregation laws, commonly known as Jim Crow laws, that Southern states adopted beginning in the 1870s. These laws required segregated washrooms, drinking fountains, park benches, and other facilities in virtually all public spaces. Only the use of streets and most stores was not restricted according to a person's race. Other discriminatory laws resulted in the wholesale disenfranchisement of black voters by 1900. In Louisiana, for example, 130,000 black voters were registered in 1896, but only 1,342 in 1904, a 99% decline in just 4 years. Various political and legal devices were invented to prevent Southern blacks from voting. Among the most common obstacles were literacy tests, poll taxes, and political party primaries for whites only. The Supreme Court again gave its sanction to such laws in a case in 1898, which had upheld the state's right to use literacy tests to determine a citizenship's qualifications for voting. Many Southern states also adopted the so-called grandfather clause, which allowed a man to vote only if his grandfather had cast ballots in elections before Reconstruction. Then, in 1896, in the landmark case of Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court upheld a Louisiana law requiring separate but equal accommodations for white and black passengers on railroads. The court ruled that the Louisiana law did not violate the 14th Amendment that guaranteed the equal protection of the law. Segregation, disenfranchisement, and lynching left African Americans in the South oppressed, but not powerless. Some responded with confrontation. Ida B. Wells, the editor of the Memphis Free Speech, a black newspaper, campaigned against lynching and the Jim Crow laws. Death threats and the destruction of her printing press forced Wells to carry out her work from the North. A second response to oppression, advocated by Booker T. Washington, was to accommodate it. Washington, a former slave, had graduated from the Hampton Institute in Virginia. In 1881, he established an industrial and agricultural school for African Americans in Tuskegee, Alabama. There, African Americans learned skilled trades, while Washington preached the virtues of hard work, moderation, and economic self-help. Earning money, he said, was like having a, quote, a little green ballot, unquote, that would empower African Americans more effectively than the political ballot. Speaking at an exposition in Atlanta in 1895, Washington argued that the agitation of the question of social equality is the extremist folly, end quote. In 1900, he organized the National Negro Business League, which established 320 chapters across the country to support businesses owned and operated by African Americans. Now, later civil rights leaders had mixed reactions to Washington's approach, especially his Atlanta speech. Some criticized him as too willing to accept discrimination. For example, after 1900, the younger African-American leader, W.E.B. Du Bois, would demand an end to segregation and the granting of equal civil rights to all Americans. What would eventually develop is two differing approaches to attempting to obtain equality. On the left, we had Booker T. Washington, the idea that equality would happen when money came before power. Essentially, he believed that African Americans would not be treated as equals until they were viewed as equals, and money and economic power was the route to that equality. However, on the right, W.E.B. Du Bois believed that African Americans would never be able to achieve economic equality until political equality was first achieved, and that political equality must be enforced through federal action. These two different approaches, a money before power, a power before money approach, or a bottom-up versus a top-down approach, would typify the coming civil rights leaders for the next 60 years. We see similar actions in the 1960s with people such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. So today, in review, what we've covered is we've talked about the development of the New South. The New South experienced some new economic developments, including new industries, as well as new transportation. However, the South remained mostly agricultural and mostly segregated during this time. We also learned about how segregation developed and becomes codified into law thanks to actions by the Supreme Court in the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, and that there is a movement that begins in the South with leaders such as Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois to start to fight against that discriminatory practices in the South. Well, that's all for today. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. Until next time, go Pack.